Hello everyone, we are again live from the Kunstquartier Bethanien in Berlin, and I am announcing now the second panel of the day, reporting on Xinjiang, first-hand accounts and big data to investigate the truths. And I'm very happy to welcome here on stage with us Megha Rajagopalan and also Stijn Deklerck that is moderating. And we have in remote Arslan Hidayat, and he is joining us on video. And on sound, we have Wang. So I'm going to introduce in detail Stijn, and then I will leave to him the stage to introduce the panel and the participants. Stijn Deklerck is a senior officer in human rights at Amnesty International Netherlands. Prior to joining Amnesty, he worked at various Chinese and international NGOs and produced several socially engaged documentaries. He holds a master's degree in law and a PhD in sinology from the University of Leuven in Belgium, where he teaches on Chinese law. Thank you very much, all of you, for being here. And we will see each other later. I just want to remind also the audience online that there is a chat on our website. So if they want to send questions to the panelists, they can do. And we will bring the questions at the end of the panel to Stijn. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tatiana, for your introduction and also for the invitation here at the conference. I'm very happy and very honored as well to moderate this panel on the current situation in Xinjiang and how to investigate the truth of what is happening there. I think by now most of you, if not all of you, know that there is a horrific human rights crisis going on in Xinjiang. Concerning the large-scale oppression of Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other predominantly Muslim ethnic groups in the region. While the Chinese government's oppression of these Muslim groups is not a new phenomenon, it has reached unprecedented levels since 2017. Since then, the Chinese authorities have really ramped up and developed extreme measures to essentially root out the religious traditions, the local language, and also the cultural practices of the region's Muslim ethnic groups. Huge numbers of men and women are arbitrarily detained and have been arbitrarily detained. They include hundreds of thousands who have been sent to prisons, in addition to hundreds of thousands, perhaps even 1 million or more, who have been sent to so-called re-education camps that are in fact internment camps. Torture and other ill treatment is systematic in the camps, and every aspect of daily life is regimented in an effort to forcibly instill a secular, homogeneous Chinese nation and Communist Party ideals. The Chinese authorities claim that they aim to root out terrorism, but in reality people have been arbitrarily detained for simple lawful conduct, such as possessing a religious-themed picture, or owning a Quran, or communicating with somebody abroad. Both inside and outside the camps, Xinjiang's Muslims are among the most heavily surveyed populations in the world. There is a huge system keeping track of their every move, including a vast network of surveillance cameras with facial recognition cameras, unfettered access to people's phones, homestays by cadres assigned to live with Muslim families, biometric data collection, etc., etc. People are being constantly monitored to see if their behavior could be a so-called threat. As I said, this includes very simple lawful behavior, such as displays of religion. The whole region is in fact more and more an open-air prison for Muslim populations. The Beijing authorities, they continue to deny that these large-scale human rights violations are taking place. And in addition, they refuse any transparency about what is really happening in the region. They refuse unfettered access to the region for independent researchers and observers, including the international media. So in this panel, we plan to analyze how the Uyghurs and other ethnic groups are subject to extreme surveillance and how tools such as open source data, geolocation techniques, and satellite photography can help to investigate the truth in Xinjiang. And we're very fortunate to have a truly excellent panel of speakers today who will, unmap all these various issues together. They include Arslan Hidayat. He's a prominent Uyghur rights activist from Australia, and he will focus on what is happening in the Uyghur region and how the Chinese government is trying to obscure the truth. They also include Megha Rajagopalan, an award-winning international correspondent for BuzzFeed News, who will talk about the lack of access for journalists in China and how she used geospatial analysis, architectural modeling, and other techniques to document the scope and the scale of China's campaign of oppression in Xinjiang. And then we have Wang, who is just as Arslan Hidayat joining us online. Wang is a senior China researcher at the Asia Division of Human Rights Watch, and she will talk about the challenges for international researchers on Xinjiang. And she will dive into her discovery and investigation of Xinjiang's big data system. So in this panel, each of the speakers will hold a 20 minutes presentation about the issues at hand. Afterwards, we'll have a moderated discussion and a Q&A with the public. We have both a live and an online audience. Do feel free to ask questions if you're online in the chat throughout the session, and we will come back to them later. So without further ado, I'm very happy to introduce our first speaker online, who is Arslan Hidayat. He's the General Secretary of the Uyghur Revival Association, an Uyghur rights organization which sheds light and raises awareness on the plight of Uyghurs. Arslan also runs a Facebook page highlighting the Uyghurs' plight in the English language. And he has been invited to share his expertise about the Uyghurs' plight by giving studio interviews, sharing his insights with many mainstream international media outlets. Arslan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I just want to thank you for giving me this platform to talk about what's been happening to my people. And unfortunately, it's gotten to this stage where, as you've mentioned, what we believe is a genocide happening to the Uyghur people. And you've sort of summarized what's been going on. So I'll just start off with a very brief history. Despite what's been happening in the Uyghur region, hitting headlines in the last 5 or so years, we know that this oppression, I don't want to get into the hundreds of years of Chinese oppression over the last 200-300 years, but specifically since CCP invasion of Chinese occupied in East Turkestan since 1949, they've been oppressed right now with the camps, but we've seen the occupation of home and land, indoctrination, destruction of culture sites and razing of mosques, banning of books and language, to arbitrary false imprisonment in prisons and concentration camps, removal of children to state-run orphanages, torture, rape, slave labor, and in a lot of cases, death as well. So before we get into sort of what's been happening in the camps and what's happening to the Uyghur people, the main question everyone asks is why. And there are various different narratives, various different versions as to why this is happening. I'll first give the actual what we believe is the truth of why this is happening. This is happening is because China, the Chinese Communist Party, have realized that they need to have a unified populace. And they've gone down the route of basically ethno-nationalism. So you have to act like Chinese and you have to be proud of being Chinese. And this is their way of trying to finally assimilate. The sorts of assimilation policies that they had before did work to an extent, but that level of assimilation they were not satisfied with. through the camps, and the ones that don't comply with these assimilation policies, they are killed, they are genocided. And so what the Chinese say is that how they are assimilating the Uyghurs is through education. Through leaked documents, we've seen that in their terms, they call it transformation through education of key groups, which is a common euphemism in China for indoctrinating of Uyghurs. So in one CUNES document, for example, the education process is described as washing brains, cleansing hearts, strengthening righteousness, and eliminating evil. So according to the Chinese government, what they tell the world is that they are placing Uyghurs in, well, initially they actually denied the existence of camps. But then because of satellite imagery, you would have seen the first sort of posts made by a man of Chinese origin in Canada named Zhang. They had no choice but to come up with, re-education or vocational training. So their narrative is that they are putting hundreds of thousands or essentially millions. They don't like to use the word millions. They sort of take that number to about 50 or 100,000 people. And they are putting them in these camps because the narrative is that these Uyghurs are uneducated, they need steady jobs. If they are left there to their own devices, then they are prone to terrorism, extremism. So even before the camps, there are euphemisms of where Uyghurs are sort of people that make shish kebabs, or especially in the eastern seaboard, we are seen as pickpocketers. And so this term Xinjiang, that it's very oriental, it's different. And so they need to educate these uneducated Uyghurs for our own good. And then they use the narrative against the United States. Well, look, we're putting people into schools and educating them. What have you done for the past 20 years in the Muslim world? Look how you're dealing with terrorism. And they sort of make that comparison in their media. But what they fail to realize is the types of people going into these camps. So you have people that have loyally worked for the Chinese Communist Party for 20, 30, 40 years. Some who are on the verge of retirement, and some who had already retired. On paper, you would automatically call these people, loyal Chinese citizens, or and who not necessarily are against Chinese policy. But there was a time in the early 2010s, especially in the last, especially 5 years, where China started. The Chinese government started arresting two-faced people. So while on the surface, these people who had worked for the government for 20, 30, 40 years looked loyal, deep down inside, they were spewing Uyghur nationalism, or that they had extreme tendencies. And so what they did was, for example, initially you saw a lot of university professors, Xinjiang University professors, vice presidents of Xinjiang University, people like Azad Sultan or Halmarat Gupur, from Xinjiang Medical University. And then you had certain scholars, the intellectuals or elites in the arts also being taken in, where the work that they had produced probably 10, 20, 30 years ago, which was probably okay for the cultural filter. It was okay back then, but now when going through that cultural filter, the things that they had written was not acceptable, and they had nationalistic tendencies. And so these people have been arbitrarily arrested, given hefty sentences like life sentences, in some cases death sentences, because they are not fully loyal to the party. Obviously, this two-faced situation isn't the first time. China used this against their own citizens for many, many years in the 50s, 60s, and 70s as well. So it's sort of a repeating of history here. So through these camps, what China aims to do is to strip the Uyghurs of their cultural identity through the banning of the Uyghur language, religious practices, and they essentially, as I mentioned before, conform and accept Xi Jinping thought as their main ideology, essentially transforming the Uyghurs into Han Chinese and assimilating them into the broader society. So I was lucky enough, I don't know if you could say lucky enough, but in speaking to some of these former concentration camp detainees, literally in the camps, before we sort of get into the torture, ideologically wise, the main thing that they try and stamp out is religion. Now, Uyghurs, just like any population who considers themselves to be Muslim, you have a small population, probably 10 to 20% who actually practice, and then you have others that identify. So it's sort of a balance, just like with any society. If you look at Turkish people or Arabs, sort of a mixed people. But the fundamentals of the religion, like believing in God, following in the steps of the Prophet Muhammad, is within most Uyghurs. So the first thing that they do is in these indoctrination classes, they are essentially told to renounce their religion. And after every single class, every single lesson, the guards check to see if that there is an inkling of religion in there. And so they'll ask the question, is there God? Does God exist? And obviously, when you're in that sort of camp, prison-like situation, the obvious answer is no. Everyone does answer no. So how are you going to catch out these people? What one concentration camp detainee told me was that the way that they catch you out is if you have some sort of hesitation. So when they ask you, is there God? Is there Allah? And you hesitate for a second or two, then you are beaten, you are tortured, you are interrogated further. And there seems to be, just like within religion, we are taught to repent to God, for our sins. But what China makes the detainees do is write letters to Xi or write letters to the government to repent to the government, because formally that they had repented to God. So you have this, and then there's further denigration from religion. So there is one of the concentration camp detainees, Zumrat Dawood. She told me that she had heard of one sister, one woman who was urinated on by guards. And the reason why she was urinated on, again, they are linking this to religion. While they were urinating on her, they said, "Don't you Muslims wash yourselves? And we do something called an ablution before we wash ourselves. So wash yourself with this urine." Or there was one testimony recently given by a Kazakh detainee who was helping essentially one part of these camps in a BBC report back in February showed us that these camps were also used as open brothels. And this woman, she was there to sort of get the women ready to be raped, and apparently the people from outside, just everyday citizens, would pay for these services as well. And she, in a recent Uyghur tribunal, said that they had used the holy book of the Muslims, and they had made the detainees defecate on the book. So this sort of denigration of religion is rampant throughout the camps. Now, whilst China, as I mentioned before, boasts having 56 groups, it actually is against diversity. So again, that's only on the surface. So you'll see images of Kashgar, people dancing and the food and the dresses. That's only at a superficial level. So they really want to stamp that out. And one main way that they have been trying to stamp this out is the removal of children. Now, if you've got millions of people in these camps, where did the children go? So these children are taken off into boarding schools, and they are, again, essentially brought up like Chinese. So you'll see many clips coming out of TikTok or Douyin, the Chinese version of TikTok, where kids, are bearing allegiance to the Chinese flag, talking Chinese. God knows what they are feeding the kids. The parents have no actual access to the children. And these boarding schools or even these camps are not voluntary. Again, that's a Chinese narrative. If these were voluntary, why can't Uyghurs make a simple phone call to their so-called studying relative, their sister, their brother, who is studying, who is apparently bettering themselves in these camps. So when one thing that China believes that they are stamping out is separatism. Now, unfortunately, a lot of the world doesn't recognize the occupation of East Turkestan. Now, whilst, as I mentioned, that two-faced person, that concept, even though that was initially attacking intellectuals or the elites of the society, it pretty much went down to everybody. Anybody that was a Uyghur, spoke the language, you were automatically said, you know, there's something in your heart. You're only saying that you're loyal to us. You're not actually loyal to us. And what China says is that after a while, that all these camps have been closed and that people have graduated. But the former teachers who are teaching at these camps, teaching Chinese Mandarin, that we've recently come to know from them that they actually had no assessment tasks, no exams. Now, I'm a teacher myself, and every 4 to 8 weeks, we give some sort of assessment, an assignment, and so we can see the progress of our students. This apparently was never ever done in the camps. So if we go back to the notion of occupation, when we mention words like East Turkestan or the Chinese occupation, the Uyghurs, only until they are able to leave China do we recognize or are we able to express that our land is occupied. China knows this as well. The name itself, Xinjiang, literally means new land, new frontier. And so this is also an underlying issue that for those that have been to the region can see that this place is nothing like China. The buildings, the mosques, the people, the way they look. And even when I used to go to the region, I mean, I used to go to the since 1991, and my last visit was in 2014. The Chinese people would describe Uyghurs as Uyghur, like foreigners, because they say, like, I'm full Uyghur and I don't look Chinese. And what China does is, whether it be through their white paper documents, they try and make, or they try and say that the Uyghurs are not Turkic. They are Chinese, or they are deep down Chinese. And so what's happening in the region is, because it looks so foreign from the rest of China, what's been happening, the buildings have been dozed. Apparently there have been, according to Chinese statistics, there are 24,000 mosques, a third of them totally destroyed, and another third of them either converted or changed, and they don't resemble a mosque anymore. And so that whole entire region is changing. And then you have the physical aspect now, forced marriages, where you'll even see advertisements of Uyghur women being forcefully married to Chinese men. And now from a humanistic perspective, forget religion for the side, any marriage that is forced, so that's what we're against the forceful marriage. And so we have these issues where China is physically changing the physical landscape as well as the cultural landscape. And now it's gotten to a stage where Uyghurs on Douyin, right? So through Chinese propaganda, through panels like this, through talking about this issue, China for the first time have had Uyghurs talk about this issue on Douyin videos. So even if you simply Google or go into Twitter, type in Chinese forced labor camps or concentration camps, you will see all of these Uyghurs denouncing such claims. Look, we're free, we're fine. The likes of Mike Pompeo are wrong, come to the region. But people forget that Uyghurs don't have access to YouTube, to Facebook, to Instagram. So how are they getting on these platforms and reading scripts? And when you see all of these videos, they are scripts. So China is feeling the pressure. There's only a few minutes left, but I want to talk about the becoming family, which is like sort of the last part where the guests here will talk about the surveillance, but it's gotten to a stage where I'm sure you've heard more than 1 million officials or cadres are living with the Uyghurs. And they call this program the living together, cooking together, eating together, learning together, and sleeping together. So the all of Uyghur life outside and inside the home is surveilled. And it's really scary when what's really bad about this is, even though some parents or the people who are being watched can get away or can lie to the officials saying they no longer believe in God or that are in practice, the scary part is when they interview children, and obviously the children don't really know what's going on, and that is where a lot of parents get caught up because being children 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, they may say something, hey, does your father pray, does your mother pray? And they'll say yes. Do they teach religion? So in some cases you see the children sort of accidentally giving up their parents, if you will. And then we have the last bit, which is which I'll mention because China have recently mentioned in their new white paper, is the birth rate. And again, the physical, the genocidal aspect of this. We know that the birth rate has fallen a good 48%. And what China does in the document is show a long-term population rise comparing 1950 to 2020, or comparing 1960 to 2020. Obviously, you're going to have a slight population rise, but what they fail to do is they don't compare the dates and the years in the past 5 years. So comparing 2017 to 2019, or comparing 2018 to 2020. So you have this physical aspect. And the last thing I'll mention is I was able to translate for a sister who worked for a hospital in Hotan, and she witnessed herself when she used to work there 100 abortion, not just abortions, but 100 operations, whether it be abortions, IUD, implantation, and she eventually had to leave the job based on ethics, and she eventually opened a clinic, privately, secretly removing IUDs. So we have this as well. I wish there was more time, but yeah, I'll just leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arslan, for your presentation. I mean,
You're
it
welcome.
is a huge issue, and it's also horrific what is happening, and yeah, I mean, I hope further on we can get further into it, but I think you already mentioned quite a few really key aspects of what is happening there and what you've been able to learn through these first-hand testimonies. And I think that's a really important source of getting the information from, seeing the big black hole that the Chinese government is making of the region. I also want to say something that also came forward in the keynote. I mean, it's really not evident for people to come and speak up. And I also want to express how much I appreciate your courage and the courage of Uyghurs that have spoken up outside of China, because I mean, intimidation of the Chinese government also goes there. And basically there's also families being taken hostage for things that Uyghur activists have been doing. So thank you very much for your work and for your contribution. And I think further on in the discussion, we can definitely also map out more of the things you mentioned about the Chinese narrative, the what aboutism, like these things are very important to get into.
Sure. Thank you.
Yes, so for now we go to a different but also a similar way of getting the truth out of what is happening there. And very honored to have Megha here with us. She made together with Alison Killing and with Christo Buschek of BuzzFeed News, an investigation in different parts. I think you're now 5 parts investigation, the last one coming out in July just of this year, that really captures the scape and the scale of like what is really going on. And you've been very inventive and creative in a way of doing that. And I think you've been really instrumental in laying bare what is actually happening over there. You also won a Pulitzer Prize in 2021 for the reporting. So yeah, please, the floor is yours, and I'm very interested to learn more in how it all came about.
Thank you so much for having me here, and Arslan, thank you especially for laying out the situation and setting up the stakes of why this is so important for us to discuss today. I'm just going to talk a bit about how I started to work on this subject, and then also how we used methods that were accessible to us from outside of China to investigate the camps. So my work over the past couple of years has focused a lot on the kind of mass internment and mass imprisonment side of this crisis. I'm a journalist by training. I work at BuzzFeed News. I was based in China, I went there first as a student, like around 2008, 2009, and then I worked there based in Beijing from 2012 to 2018. So I guess I'm, okay, thanks. Yeah, so this photo is actually from a trip to Kashgar, which is a city in the south of Xinjiang that I took in 2017. So kind of in the early part of 2017, I was in Beijing. I was working as a foreign journalist, and things in Xinjiang had sort of never been really good. Uyghurs and other Muslim ethnic minority groups had come under these like kind of periodic periods of repression. There had been issues with terrorism and like protest in the region, along with migration and lots of other human rights issues. But around 2017, we had started to hear that things were starting to get a lot worse. There were suddenly stories that were starting to come out that people would tell, like in the region, about these things called re-education centers. And nobody really knew what this was. Like, it could have been a kind of euphemistic way to describe, other forms of extrajudicial internment and imprisonment that already exist in China, like systems like this. But we didn't know specifically in the context of Xinjiang what this meant. So I sort of decided that I was gonna, try and learn a little bit more about these facilities and learn a bit more about how things were changing in Xinjiang. But one of the problems, even then, was that access in the region is really, really tough, as Stan pointed out, like for journalists and for researchers. And the kind of the way this looks is that when you land in the region, if you are a person with like a journalist visa in your passport, or if you're marked as a researcher or something in some way, you immediately get detained by police. So so what if you're a Chinese national? So in that case, if you were a journalist, it would be very, very hard for you to do this work, pretty much impossible for you to do this work in the first place. And that's because of the kind of extreme sensitivity of reporting about Uyghurs in any way. And also because any work that you did manage to do would immediately be censored. So that was pretty much true back then, and now it's true to a much greater degree. And that's why you don't see coverage of this issue in the Chinese language press, for instance, even though there are a lot of really great journalists that are working in China. So I was like thinking about how can I do this research without sort of immediately being detained, and I sort of came up with this method that I was going to go to Turkey, which is where a lot of Uyghur migrants had settled at that time, and try to talk to people who had left the region fairly recently about what they had heard. And I went and I talked to a lot of people, and they told stories much like Arslan just told us, about stories about surveillance, about detention, about people being taken away suddenly in the middle of the night to these camps. And to everyone that I talked to, I was like, well, do you know what these places are? Like, where are they? And finally, I met someone who was like, yeah, I know what that is. There was something like that around where I used to live in Kashgar. So we went back and forth, and he told me, so approximately where it was. There was like a big hotel at the top of the street, and he said if you walk south, you can find it, and he told me some other landmarks. So I went to Kashgar, I went by taxi and on foot, and I went to the hotel, and I literally walked down and looked for it, and sure enough, there was this kind of massive compound. You can see these really high walls here, and it was sort of plastered with advertisements like this one. And this is, if anyone doesn't read Chinese, it says, among other things, cherish ethnic unity as you would cherish your own eyes. So it was very clear to me what this was. There was actually a sign up in the front of the camp that said that it was for education. I talked to, there was like a police kiosk outside, and I talked to a bunch of the kind of like neighbors, like people that worked at the neighboring businesses, and they said, I think one person said to me who worked at a local tea shop, he said people go in there and they don't come out anymore. So it was very clear to me what it was. So eventually we published a story about this, and it was sort of the first big piece that I wrote about Xinjiang for BuzzFeed. That story, along with some other events, led to me most likely losing my access and my visa to the country after some 6 years working there as a journalist. And around that time, there were a lot of reports coming out about Xinjiang. And there was a lot of kind of like different kinds of information coming out about these camps. Like people were really starting to pay attention. UN officials were making statements, as were governments, but nobody really knew where these camps were, or how many of them, or how many people they could hold. And the estimates were like differing wildly. So I started to think about like, how could I try to find more of these places? Like it was so labor intensive, like finding this one place. I had to go and actually find a person that knew where it was. So fortuitously around that time, I met a woman called Alison Killing, who will be here from tomorrow, and we started to work on this project together. So Alison is an architect by training and a geospatial analyst, and together we started to think about how can we use satellite imagery among other sources to try and find more of these camps. We wanted to try and find all of them, basically. So we tried a few different methods, and including some that didn't work. But one thing that did lead to something was this. So this is a blank tile. So this is actually on Baidu Maps. And if anyone's unfamiliar, Baidu is basically China's answer to Google. It's Google's blocked in China, so Baidu is a search giant. They have a lot of the same functions as Google, and one of those is Maps. So Alison noticed this, that when we went to locations in Baidu maps of places where we already knew that there were going to be camps, this weird tile would appear, right? So immediately we thought and if you zoomed in, it would disappear and then reappear again. So immediately we thought maybe this is some type of censorship. I think it could have been other things, like for instance if there was cloud cover or something like that. But it turns out that Baidu actually has a different sort of tile, like a blanked out tile for when there's not a good image. And I think sort of since then it's sort of been confirmed to us that this is in fact censorship. So so we thought, what if we could find more of these tiles, and that would give us a clue in this kind of enormous region of Xinjiang, which contains millions of satellite tiles. That would give us a clue as to where these camps actually are. So that's exactly sort of what we did. That's what our team did, me, Alison, and Christo Buszczak, who's a developer. So this was sort of our original map. It wasn't so easy as find the blank tiles and you find the camps. Unfortunately, there are lots of locations in China that are censored for all kinds of reasons. It might be a military base, it might be some other type of government facility, some sort of sensitive facility. But this is basically once we got to that initial data set, we were then able to narrow it even further. Using other sources, including human sources, documentation, and stuff like that, and then also by looking at the kind of fundamental features of these buildings, so which I'll show in a second. But I can talk a little bit more about the color coding if anyone's curious. But we've essentially separated them into different levels of corroboration. The kind of features of the prisons and camps that I'm talking about became really apparent to us, first of all, just by examining lots of these images, and then also by looking at Chinese prison rules and regulations, which are actually a public document. Yeah. So at that time we found 176. Oh, sorry. These are 268 facilities. Since then we've established I think about a few dozen more based on research done by other researchers as well as ourselves. And I think 92 of them were corroborated by other sources, and then 176 at that time were based on examining satellite imagery alone. Yeah. So this is an example of what a camp looks like, and you can see some of the features of it. So this is in a place called Shufu County, which is actually south of Kashgar, which is the first place that I showed you. So basically, the reason this camp is interesting is that, first of all, that it's high security, and you can see that on the 2 layers of barbed wire. On either side of the perimeter walls. The capacity is estimated by Allison, based on a measurement of gross floor areas, is about 7,000. So what's interesting about this facility is that, as Arslan just pointed out, there was a time in December of 2019 where a senior official from Xinjiang went to a press conference in Beijing and made the statement that this is over. Like, everybody has graduated from these re-education facilities, right? And think about, this is in the midst of an entire wave of public pressure from governments and human rights organizations and the media. And, you know, if you read between the lines, even if you're not a person that takes Chinese government officials at face value, you might think, okay, well, maybe they're winding down this program amid all of this pressure. And what we found was actually the opposite, unfortunately. So this camp, the construction on this started just 3 months after that statement was made. So that was March. And after that, it was, I think it was, basically it was completed about a month later, if I have that correctly. So basically what we started to see, this was sort of one of our biggest conclusions, is that the kind of first generation of camps, like the one that I showed in the beginning that I visited, were actually repurposed public buildings. So they were like vocational schools or like old folks' homes or high schools that had basically been fitted with all of this security architecture and turned into camps. But the camps and prisons that were being built from scratch by the government were not like that. They were purpose-built facilities, and they had way more security architecture than the first generation of camps. And the testimonies, sort of the witnesses that we interviewed, reflected that. The people that had been held as soon as this mass detention program started around 2016, 2017, would talk about being taken to places that they knew about in their communities, like an old high school or something. And they would talk about this gross overcrowding because, in the end, a high school is not a prison, right? It's not built to house a lot of people. But what we saw was that the government was starting to build these kind of mega facilities. So this is a camp at a place called Dabancheng, which is near the regional capital in Urumqi. And as you can see, it's about the size of Central Park in New York. And it can, based on a measurement of floor areas, again, done by Allison, this has the capacity to hold more than 30,000 people. And the way that we arrive at that is that Chinese prison regulations specify how many people per square foot there should be in a prison, and that's not even factoring in the overcrowding that is just really rampant at these facilities. Yeah, and I just wanted to quickly show this. This is, I believe it's a Reuters photo, but this is what the camp, what Dabancheng, that facility, actually looks like from the outside. Yeah, and then I wanted to talk a little bit about this town. This is I think it's this. This is also a wire photo. So this is a town called Mongokure. It's basically on the Chinese border with Kazakhstan, and it's a town that we sort of focused on in the course of doing this series. Basically, it's this really idyllic town that's known for tourism and horseback riding, and the minority population there is mostly ethnic Kazakhs. And basically, we were able to identify 4 different camps in this town, and the one that we focused on is the northernmost one, which is Main Camp. So this is an architectural rendering of this camp. So the reason that we decided to focus on this, there were a couple of reasons, but one is that sort of fortuitously, we were able to meet 3 different men who were all detained in the same camp. Their stints were sort of overlapping, and they didn't know each other at the time, but sort of came to know each other later. And because like this is like extremely rare, like I can't tell you how rare this is to meet 3 different people that were held at the same facility, because there are just so few people that are able to actually talk about these experiences. So that was sort of, it sort of enabled us to attach another layer of kind of corroboration to some of the details that we were seeing in this imagery. And like, basically what's interesting about this, another thing that's sort of interesting about this facility is that it shows us kind of 3 different phases of the government's mass incarceration, mass detention campaign. So in the first image in March 2016, you can see that there was a pretrial detention center there. So the 3 men that we interviewed described actually being held at this place in a kind of prior stint, like when they were returning to the country from abroad. And that detention center, I think, has been there actually for a number of years. But when you get to 2018, you can see that there's a lot more building, and all 3 men were eventually brought back to the same facility, and they were brought to this kind of second group of buildings that had just been built. And then those were, they were essentially held there in cells, right? And then after they left, once you get to 2019, you can see these blue buildings in the northern part of the camp. And those are actually factories. We did not interview anyone who was forced to work at these factories, but they all had known that these factories were being built. And yeah, and then the last thing I'll say about that is that basically, like, I think that what was really remarkable about this is that when you examine a satellite image, it can tell you a lot, but it doesn't tell you everything, right? It doesn't tell you what these facilities look like on the inside. It doesn't necessarily tell you everything that you want to know about the experience of actually being held there. But because of these former detainees who were brave enough to be able to speak out, we were able to gather a lot of detail. Like, for instance, we would ask them how many windows are there in your cell? And they would say 1, right? And then that would enable us to sort of count the number of windows in a row and try to determine like how many cells there actually were. They talked a lot about like little features about life inside, like for instance, like the cameras that there were in each room, the lines that determine like in what direction they could move. By sort of going back and forth with them, like we spent a lot of time going back and forth on like, on Signal and stuff like that. Between the satellite image and their kind of recollections, we were sort of able to build a much more complete version, or complete kind of like rendition of like what this camp is actually like. Yeah, and I'll just show this last thing. So this is a woman named Dina Nerdibai. She is ethnic Kazakh woman, also from Xinjiang. She's 28 years old. She is a toddler. She's quite successful. So she has a quite unique story in that she's one of the very few people that was forced to labor in a factory while staying in a camp. She was basically moved between, I think, 4 or 5 facilities, and she had this career before she was detained. Like, she ran like basically a tailoring shop, and like she was sort of building this empire as an entrepreneur, selling garments. And she was detained. She had no idea why. And eventually, she got to this camp where there was a factory attached. And the reason that's interesting is that, like, in the kind of beginning of this campaign, we didn't really see forced labor as much of a feature as we do now. But she's sort of one of the few people that I've met that actually experienced this and is willing to talk about it in the context of being held in a camp. And basically at this factory, like somebody found out that she had this previous experience making garments, and so they put her in this position where she was actually teaching all of these women like how to sew, and she had really strong recollections of what that was like. She said that in these factories, like basically everything is separated into cubicles. Everything is sort of like the scissors are chained to the desks. The doors are all locked so that people cannot escape. And I said, if you're a teacher, like, did you get any privileges that everyone else didn't? She said, well, I had a key fob to use the bathroom, and I didn't have to ask permission. So that was pretty much it. She was never paid, and she said that she never heard of anybody else being paid. And, you know, the thing is, so she lives in Kazakhstan now, and she's restarted her business, and she's doing okay, but, you know, when we talked, she said, like, you know, this ruined my life. Like, she basically, she had business loans she couldn't pay back. She couldn't fill customer orders. Like, she had spent all of this time building her life up, and she completely lost everything. And I think that's sort of the context that we have to see this in. You know, Arslan has mentioned so many examples of how this can destroy people's lives. The people that you see being interviewed by journalists are actually the most lucky people, because they're the ones that were able to actually leave. There are many other people, like the overwhelming majority of people are still in the region and suffering greatly under these policies. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Megha. It's, I mean, really inspiring also to see like the various type of work that have gone into it. It's indeed like this kind of spatialing, but then also talking and also like talking with people who have gone through trauma and kind of like reimagining. I think that is also like a skill in itself. And well, I hope audience have already managed to get a ticket for your workshop on Sunday, while you, together with Alison, will talk more about everything that you did. Very impressive, and I think later on we can talk also more about like these various techniques that journalists have used, like this one. Also, a lot of procurement documents of the government that have been kind of up. Testimonies, of course, but then, yeah, this really kind of almost new ways of using technology for the good, I would say, whereas it's being used for the bad. I mean, you also really show that like we can really get out the truth. And with that, I would like to move to our last speaker in this panel, definitely not the least, as she has really done very extensive research for a long time on various aspects in China, on the use of torture, arbitrary detention, human rights defenders, civil society, disability rights, women's rights in China. She's Maya Wang. She's a senior China researcher in the Asia division at Human Rights Watch. Her research on Xinjiang and definitely like China's use of technology for mass surveillance, including biometrics, artificial intelligence, big data. It was also one of these factors that really helped to galvanize international attention on these developments. So she will dive into this big data system a bit more, and will also talk more about like the issues and the ways, the instruments, the tools that she has used as a researcher to really get the reality of what is happening in Xinjiang to light. So with that, Maya, the floor is yours.
Start by saying that the Human Rights Watch has published on the situation on Xinjiang on a variety of issues, from the government's mass detention of Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims to the use of what Arslan mentioned, this Becoming Family program, where government officials essentially impose themselves into Uyghur families to monitor them as to enforce propaganda on these families, to the use of mass surveillance. And since our session talks about how do we find out about the truth, I think Megha also kind of elaborated a little bit on how as researchers we generally triangulate information from various sources, especially in a closed country like Xinjiang, which has not allowed Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International to go in and investigate. The difficulties of investigating severe abuses has been some of the hardest. It's one of the hardest regions to investigate in the world. So we generally triangulate information from talking with people who have been affected, to using government documentation, checking the consistency of information across the board, as well as kind of evaluating, is that first-hand information or second-hand information. The other kind of challenge is that Xinjiang is actually quite a big region. Trying to find out whether or not information from one region of Xinjiang is applicable to another part of Xinjiang is also another challenge. To what extent something is isolated versus systematic? Is that something that's happening to one person in one camp versus everywhere in that region is yet another challenge in our work on Xinjiang. So with these kind of broad principles, let me just dive into one research that we have done over the years, and that is the investigation into the Xinjiang government's or Xinjiang police use of big data in monitoring the population there. The system is called the Integrated Joint Operations Platform, and in many ways it is almost like the brain of the mass surveillance systems in the region that ties or gets information from many different sources to generate analytics for the Xinjiang authorities and to aid detention and imprisonment of Uyghurs. When we published our report on the IJOP system, we made a video about that to explain. So I'll just have that video played, and for you to get a sense of what is that all about. So if that could be done, that'd be great.
I used to be one of those people, like, I got nothing to hide, I'm just a student, but I was very wrong. They're targeting everyone. As long as you're going out of your house, you're being surveilled.
In Xinjiang, in northwestern China, 13 million Turkic Muslims are already enduring extraordinary suppression at the hands of the Chinese government. Authorities there are building a surveillance state to be able to track their every move.
Across the northwestern province of Xinjiang, an estimated 1 million Chinese Muslims have vanished into a vast network of detention centers for what China calls re-education.
The region is now under what's probably the most intense government surveillance in the world.
Every 200 meters would have a police checkpoint. And then on top of that, there are all these checkpoints at public places wherever you go. If you're Uyghur, they stop you. They would just say, "Where's your ID? I want to check your ID." They would punch in the ID number and then they would see everything about you.
One tool at the heart of Xinjiang's surveillance system is the IJOP, or the Integrated Joint Operations Platform. The IJOP has an app that's used by police and government officials to track extraordinary amounts of personal information about individuals, ranging from their religious habits to their blood type.
Human Rights Watch got a hold of a copy of the app and used a technique called reverse engineering to look at the source code, basically the design of the app. This is what it looks like when an officer pulls up an individual's profile. They enter the person's name, ID number, ethnicity, then the officer takes a photo of the person's ID card to see if that matches the person's face. As you scroll, you see more information is being collected from the person, including their address, how tall they are, their blood type, their educational level, their occupation, their political affiliation, information about their car, license plate, driver's name, driver's ID card number.
On its surface, most of this information looks like standard fare for police, but as we dig deeper into the app, we can see that ordinary, routine legal behavior is being treated by authorities as suspect.
This is what it looks like when the IJOP system has flagged someone whose phone number the system has lost track of. The IJOP system sends an alert to government officials to go and investigate the reason why that phone number has gone missing, and note if this person is suspicious and requires further investigation. Or here's another example. This is a report that the IJOP system sends to government officials about someone who used an unusual amount of electricity. The report includes the date in which the unusual amount of electricity used was logged by the system, how much electricity was used, what was the meter reading, and what is the usual range of electricity used. Then the government official is required to go and investigate this person.
If you use WhatsApp or Viber or Telegram, that might be considered suspicious. If you go at the back door of your house instead of the front, the police might turn up to investigate. The list goes on. The information from the app feeds into a central system and combines with information from other surveillance systems, including CCTV cameras that rely on facial recognition software, and even Wi-Fi sniffers that are used as people walk through checkpoints to pull information off their phones. The IJOP system aggregates all this data about people, flags those it deems suspicious, and sends alerts to nearby officials. These dubious criteria are being used to identify large numbers of people, many of whom are then arbitrarily locked up.
In total, I spent about a month in different jails. I wasn't officially accused of anything or charged with anything. The official paperwork said something like, I was arrested under the suspicion of disrupting the societal order. Then after that, I was basically under house arrest, because they marked my ID card.
It's time for the Chinese government to stop persecuting perfectly legal behavior. It's time for the Chinese government to end its repression of Turkic Muslims in Xinjiang, and it's time for it to dismantle this surveillance state.
Everyone in Xinjiang, and it monitors people's movements by tracing phones, vehicles, and their ID cards. They keep tracks of people's use of electricity and gas station. The app's source code also reveals that the government pays specific attention to 36 types of people for data collection. For example, people who stop using their smartphones, using like an old-fashioned phone instead of smartphones, people who fail to socialize with their neighbors, and people who collect money or materials for mosques with enthusiasm. And certain dubious criteria are being used to, so once the IJOP, like I have described, it is connected to the surveillance camera system across the region. It's connected to the gas stations system, which analyze who has been getting gas for their cars. How many times do they go every day? Do the license plate recognition system recognizes the cars being driven through the region? Are these cars going in places where they're not supposed to go? Are these cars being driven by their owners or someone else? And if there is a mismatch in between the license plate and the person driving the cars, the IJOP system then uses the IJOP system is programmed to be picking out certain kind of criteria that are considered by the authorities as suspicious. So these criteria are, for example, if you use WhatsApp instead of the Chinese version WeChats, like the video showed, if you use too much electricity, if you use virtual private networks, then these kind of like criteria would be used by the IJOP system to flag to the authorities about you. So, and the people who are flagged by the IJOP system, or sorry, there's one more criteria. If you have kind of dubious relationships, if you are traveling with someone who are on the police watch list, if you have family and friends in sensitive countries usually mean Muslim countries like Turkey, Afghanistan, then these people are flagged by the police for interrogation. When the police interrogate these people, many of them are then sent to political education camps or prisons. Many of them are still here, are still in prisons right now as we speak. Like what Megha said, the crisis is ongoing. In addition to that, the IJOP system essentially works as a virtual kind of movement regulator throughout the region, or it works as a series of virtual and invisible fences throughout the region. So when we think about the crisis in Xinjiang, it's not just about the political education camps, not even about the prisons in which a countless number of Uyghurs, probably 1 million of them, are currently being held. We should think about the region as essentially a region of many invisible fences, where these checkpoints, ubiquitous in urban areas and at the entrance of rural areas, are regulating people's movements. So you may be allowed to only walk within your village. In order to go to a town, you have to report to the police to go to town to work. you may only be allowed to be working in this county. You cannot go from one county to the next. In order to go to another county, you have to apply to the police a procedure that is called to seek a vacation. This is the level of movement restrictions that are imposed on Uyghurs because they are who they are. So now I'm going to, so this is how the IJOP works. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we discovered the IJOP system. And I would go back a little bit to 2017, like what Megha had described, at a time when much of the world has not really heard of what's going on in Xinjiang, and we haven't either, or we just heard about these rumors. And we weren't too sure what's happening in these political education camps. Are they different from what the Chinese government has been doing to people who are Falun Gong practitioners or other kind of groups of people for exercising their human rights? Or it was very unclear. So back in 2017, Human Rights Watch started investigating these camps. And we started interviewing people about them. And that was when we interviewed someone who was living in the region of Xinjiang. And our primary focus of the interview was about these camps. And the person started talking about it. And one of my colleagues, Sophie Richardson, who was in the video, asked a question. It was a great question because I would not have ever thought of asking a very basic question. So she asked, so how did the police know who to pick? There is like, I think 11 million Uyghurs living in Xinjiang, right? How did they figure that, like, you know, which one are going to detention? Of course, someone like me who has worked on China for so long would be very cynical. So I'll be like, well, you know, the Chinese government choose whoever it is. It doesn't matter. But this question led to a very unexpected answer. The answer was that the person said, oh, there is a computer system. And so our jaws started dropping. And we were like, so what is the computer system? He said the computer system is called integrated, 一体化, 3 characters in Chinese. He said one day he was sitting in the police station and he saw this list being churned out by the computers. And that the police were talking about this 一体化 system generating so many lists of people for detention that the police were complaining, how are we ever going to have time to detain all these people? So that was from 3 characters in Chinese that we started a 2-year investigation looking into Xinjiang's big data system. So I started, of course, as someone who have not really heard anything about this 一体化 system, by searching on Google, which started, it turns out mostly kind of military operations. But later, with more specific Chinese terms as we go along in the search, more kind of digital breadcrumbs in the search, I found out that the full name of the system is called the Integrated Joint Operations Platform. I found procurement documents from the Xinjiang police, which describe what the IJOP does. So in 2018, based on official documentation and the source information and other sources that we subsequently found, we produced a press release about it in 2018 on the Integrated Joint Operations Platform, which already described quite a lot of what we know about the Integrated Joint Operations Platform. But nonetheless, the description of that is pretty vague. We don't know much about what it actually does. But during that research, I stumbled across, literally, as I was essentially kind of more Googling, a number of apps that are being used in Xinjiang. Again, back in the days, one has never heard of the Chinese police using apps for surveillance and so on. It was very unusual, and I didn't know what these apps were doing, and I didn't know why this app has the same name as the big data system I was interested in. And before knowing anything about these apps, I asked our chief security officer at Human Rights Watch whether or not it was just safe to download these apps. He looked into these apps and he said, hey, like one of these has a lot of information. Take a look at it. And I looked, and the Chinese characters in the app source code already shows that this has a lot of information about mass surveillance. It has some words about detain, arrest, height, blood type, car color, but it doesn't quite hang together. Like, I don't know what it says, what it means. how to interpret that. But because I obtained the app through Googling, the first step to investigate this is to authenticate that the app is indeed a policing app rather than some app that some random person had made. So in order to authenticate it, I found the company name in the source code. We then found the company's other app that has been officially released on official website. That other app has a digital certificate, a number or a string of number and alphabets on it that matches this IJOP app that I have found. And therefore, I was able to authenticate that the company that produced IJOP app is indeed the same company that is also produced other official apps. So that much information we know. But then the next step we stored for many, many months because we don't really know. There has never been a human rights investigation into a policing app ever. So how does actually one interpret that was a big question, because if you look at official documents, as a researcher, you know how to interpret official documents. But as someone who has never looked into an app, the interpretation of which was very difficult. So after a long process, we were able to engage a company actually based in Berlin called Cure 53 that helped us to reverse engineer the app, looked into the source code. And when we worked together, and that was, again, a very difficult part due to the lack of money from a Human Rights Watch or a human rights organization, but also due to different expertise. I come from a human rights background. Cure 53 comes from a security tech background, trying to communicate and figuring out what kind of language are we even talking about? What is the level of proof that is necessary for saying an abuse has taken place from the source code? It took another year. There's a phrase in Chinese that we say, it's like chicken talking to the ducks. It's mutual incomprehension sometimes. And in that process, we ran out of money at one time. But luckily, we pushed through all of that. And we're able to produce a report and the video that you saw today. Without going into too much details, I would just say that the Chinese government pushed back a lot on what's happening in Xinjiang, casting doubt especially on certain researchers, smearing them, their backgrounds and their personal life. What is happening in Xinjiang is not so hard to prove because a lot of it is actually in official documents that are publicly available for anyone who wants to know in Chinese. However, what is difficult is the details of oppression, and that often is the one that is hardest as a researcher. So, for example, in the IJOP app, there are so many questions we still have not been able to answer. Is some of the code live or some of the code dead? Those are some of the details that are often have to rise to a level of proof for us to say, well, this has actually happened. This is actually being operationalized in practice. And those we have to actually triangulate it by talking to people who have information about the operation of the system. And after the release of the IJOP app, I actually there was at least one government official that reached out to me to talk about the IJOP app. And this is from talking to that person and other people afterwards that was able to get even more information to corroborate some of the research that I have done. So I ran out of time, but I think this is a story of how we do research in Xinjiang, and I'm happy to answer more questions about the aftermath of this kind of research. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Maya. And it was really a groundbreaking research, and I mean, really lauding also your attention to detail. We will now go into the discussion part of this panel. So I will start off with some questions, but like before, if you have a question to ask, raise your hand or put them in the chat online, and we can integrate them. So yes, I think to go back to what Maya also said in the end, like in the end, it's not that hard. a lot of the information is out there, but then it really is about like the details and how do you kind of like map that out and how do you make sure that you're 110% like really certain of everything that is going around. And I think these are the standards that, yeah, we want to do because we know that the Chinese government is going to try to really push back on these findings and is going to come out with like these statements and is also going to invest basically in this huge propaganda system which churns out these videos and, like Maya also mentioned, like smears people who have done research and intimidates and threatens and really attacks people of the diaspora who've gone and really spoken up about that. So I think I would like to open up a bit that discussion with all three of you. I mean, how do you deal with, like, I don't know, that kind of idea that's always there of like, okay, is this going to be retorted or like, I mean, have you experienced these personal kind of smears as well? And I mean, how does that kind of also influence the way that you operate? So. Yeah, maybe Megha, as you're sitting right next to me, can you comment briefly on that?
I'm being singled out. So I think Arslan and Maya will have very different perspectives on this because they come from different backgrounds to mine. But I mean, for me, I think as a foreign national, you have a degree of protection that others don't necessarily enjoy. And also as a person who doesn't have Chinese heritage, I think also affords a degree of protection. I primarily think about this in terms of how to protect sources and colleagues, particularly interpreters and drivers and people like that. I think, yeah, I mean, without going into too much detail, I think people, fortunately, nobody that I've interviewed has faced retaliation that I know of, but that's something that we monitor and, like, we're very conscious of. Like, for me personally, like, obviously I lost my visa to China, which I mentioned, and I think the only thing that happened, we of course, like, proactively went to the Chinese government every single time to get their comments and their response, and we've included it in every single story. We think that's really important. Before the first story, we sent like a full list of coordinates of all of the camps and prisons that we had uncovered, and yeah, I think that's sort of a transparency measure that, you know, I think, I don't know how they respond to that, but like, at least there's no surprises for them. The only kind of possibly retaliatory thing that happened last year was that a Chinese diplomat doxed me on Twitter, which is like put my passport or like my old China visa on the internet, and is more strange than anything. But I think like primarily the people that work on this, like all of my colleagues, I know we try to think very, very carefully about who we interview and how to make sure that there's really like informed consent when people are coming forward with their stories, you know, both in the context of their personal safety, even abroad because of the level of harassment that people face, but also in the context of safety of their families. And you know, I try to think really hard about how to give people the space and the freedom to make their own decisions about that, but then also inform them of the kind of like risks of having their name or their photo in a place like BuzzFeed.
Okay, thank you. Arslan, would you like to comment on this? Yeah, also especially like we mentioned before, I think especially for the diaspora, it's really hard to come out there. And I mean, just recently there has been like also a really vicious smearing campaign and these videos coming out of people who have publicly come out. So, I mean, how has the community dealt with that, and how have you also tried to reach out to people about that?
Yeah, so right now, for a lot of the Uyghurs, they've been getting, say, private harassment through WeChat. You know, take down your tweets. Or there were many occasions where, you know, a person would hold up a picture of their father or their mother or their brother or their sister, and then they'd be contacted, and they go, look, they have a video call with their loved one, and then that person sort of goes, you know what, I'll be out in a week, or I'm already out, take down your tweets. And then they make these promises to them. And then that person sort of stops advocating for their family, but then starts again because they realize that they were lied. But now those sort of public videos, it's very scary, as I said before, when you can't contact or call your loved one through even WeChat or WhatsApp or whatever app, but you're being connected with your family through a CCP propaganda video saying, I've never been to an education camp, or even if they had, it was good for me, I received training, and that they were never ever oppressed in any way, but you could clearly see physically, whether it be the hair that was gone or that they had lost lots and lots of weight, 10, 20, 30 kilos. You see a lot of this. And me personally as well, the work that I sort of do is sort of through social media and through other Chinese experts / influencers. And so if you simply just Google or Facebook or Twitter my name, you'll get a lot of people trying to debunk or say that I lie about things. And we've always said, look, if you've got to hide, open your borders. Let's go in there. Technically Uyghurs on paper are Chinese citizens. Why don't Uyghurs have Chinese passports? Why can't they leave the region? Why can't Uyghurs go into the region? So these are questions that they haven't been able to answer at all.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Maya, also, well, for you, if you would like to comment, and I'm also thinking about your last comment about this government official that actually like reached out to you after reading the research. I mean, it reminds me of like this leak that the New York Times published, and which was basically Communist Party internal document really detailing like how after Xi Jinping visited the region in 2014 was real start, and it uncovered all these incredible details. And there was one issue also of like officials basically being punished for not going along with this huge campaign of repression. So I mean, it does show that like also inside of like that whole system there are people that are not okay, and usually people that have been working there for a long time. So I mean, is that something that is very specific to Xinjiang now, and have you like also encountered it on other occasions? Maya?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. One thing to remember about what's happening in Xinjiang is that this is taking place in the context of great and greater repression throughout the country of China. So you're talking about Chinese people who are essentially also facing increasing repression, and they're terrified too. The Chinese bureaucracy is actually under increasing control by the Chinese central government, because to be successfully repressive, you have to have a very strong centralized bureaucracy. And that is what's happening in Xinjiang, is that the Xinjiang government officials, at least the lower level frontline ones, are very aggrieved at the amount of work that they have been required to do. And they disagree also with some of the ways in which the Uyghurs are being treated. They think that this policy is counterproductive. And of course, I'm speaking generally. I would imagine some officials may be supportive. So it is also through officials who disagree with the crackdown, that we are able to learn a lot about what's going on in Xinjiang. Of course, we have to be very careful in protecting these sources.
Yes, for sure, definitely. I mean, you also touched upon something, and Megha did before too, like, well, the rest of China. And I mean, we know that there have been like this history of like re-education camps, like in various forms and guises, like throughout China. But I mean, Xinjiang has been often kind of described as this lab for surveillance, where basically now like all these new ways are tested out to maybe then be also applied in other regions. So could you maybe say something about that, Maya?
Yeah, I disagree with the lab analogy because that would kind of describe a very almost systematic rollout from Xinjiang. What's happening is more kind of that the rest of China is remarkably consistent in the designs of mass surveillance systems, with Xinjiang systems being a particularly intrusive example of this national design because of the way Uyghurs are treated historically, that they're being more. Xinjiang has long been a region that is particularly repressed. And so surveillance being used across the country is just expressed in that kind of more intrusive manner. What we are seeing is rather a race to the bottom when it comes to surveillance. Each provincial police is kind of touting their better technology, their more sophisticated models, and spending quite a lot of money onto it. So there's these surveillance companies are also kind of peddling their wares with questionable efficacy, but nonetheless, the Chinese government is never going to be held accountable for failures of these systems. So you have just seen that the system supposedly pick out, quote, terrorists. But who do they pick out? They pick out people who use too much electricity. How is that even sophisticated? It's the opposite of sophistication. And that is why I always resist the terms sophisticated or experiment as to describe the systems in China when it comes to the use of mass surveillance.
It's just basically the force and I don't know, the real kind of scape and the scale at which they are being applied that really kind of I don't know, grasps hold of what is going on there. I don't know, there has been much talk about China and tech, and also how I don't know, this surveillance system goes into China, but then also kind of goes to other parts of the world. I mean, there have been cases of Ecuador, but also other countries kind of buying this kind of surveillance gear. So I mean, in that sense, would you say I don't know, that race to the bottom is also something that kind of plays into that? Is it part of a Chinese model to kind of go not necessarily with very sophisticated things, but more kind of this whole encompassive way of surveillance into other places?
I would say that if you look at the Chinese use of mass surveillance, it is a multi-dimensional and multi-layered system that requires the design, not only technologies, but importantly, administrative designs. So you have to have a national ID system. You have to have a requirement called real name registration, where you require people in order to access services, such as taking a long distance bus, you have to have your ID. The real name registration then allows the government to track you in many different places. The mass collection of biometrics from the population. These are a combination of designs that enable the Chinese government to implement mass surveillance to the extent that it has been able to do so. Other countries, on the other hand, may not, and I think most of them do not, have that kind of capabilities, at least in the developing countries. So what we do see, the sale of mass surveillance systems from China, is primarily what I call kind of off-the-shelf systems. Facial recognition systems being sold to the police. This is not to say that these are not abusive systems, especially in an abusive context. But at the same time, we are also not necessarily seeing kind of the Xinjiang-style mass surveillance in other countries, at least not yet. And so between those two levels, I think we have some time to arrest these kind of developments, which we have to do by targeting the mass surveillance companies, that they should not be allowed to violate human rights, and essentially create a world where, perhaps described by Orwell, that the boot is permanently going to be on humanity's face, by legislating international rules that outlaw these activities. Right now, these companies are selling in complete absence of international rules. And this is not just Chinese companies. We also know companies from, for example, Israel and the US and Europe are also selling various forms of surveillance technologies, hacking devices to abusive governments, and these all have to stop. So I look forward to working together on stopping the proliferation of surveillance systems around the world.
Great. Yeah, in our preparation, Megha, you also talked about this, like, I don't know, responses and basically also, like, I don't know, from the stakeholders that we have over here, how are they reacting and are they doing, well, are we all basically doing enough to address this?
You're talking about surveillance in Xinjiang specifically?
Surveillance. I mean, you can also take the question a bit broader. Like, okay, what are we not doing enough? I mean, there has been like policy response, and there has been like attention, but what is still more needed?
I mean, I'm a journalist, which means that I'm a big fan of public shaming. I think shaming bad actors is extremely effective. And yeah, I mean, so just taking, this is a little bit of a tangent, but just taking surveillance as an example. So, you know, I think a few years ago, if you'd asked me about face recognition technology used by law enforcement around the world, I would have said, this is becoming the new norm. Exactly because of what Maya said. There's a complete absence of regulation of, first of all, of sales and proliferation, and then also use by law enforcement agencies around the world. So this is not just a China problem, right? This is in many countries around the world. But, you know, what did we see last year in the US? We saw 3 huge companies, Amazon, IBM, and Microsoft, proactively say, we're not going to sell face rec to law enforcement agencies in the US anymore. So they didn't say this necessarily, I mean, I can't see into their hearts, right? But I would suspect it's not necessarily a purely altruistic move, but rather a decision made in the context of escalating public pressure from the media, from privacy activists, and a fear of greater regulation that would have happened if this had become, you know, a tool primarily used by law enforcement. Okay, so this doesn't solve the problem of facial recognition invading people's privacy, because you still have all of these issues around, you know, private companies using it around consent in public spaces and so forth. But it is like, that is something that people in China don't have. Like, they don't have the ability to create public pressure, even against private companies, in that mold, when it pertains to something like law enforcement, or in the case of Xinjiang, to national security, or what the government sees as national security. So from my perspective, that's an additional responsibility on all of us that do have the ability to go on social media or some other platform to use to exact pressure on companies, particularly, you know, companies that are based here in Europe or the United States that are more responsive to, you know, to public pressure and to shareholder pressure. But also Chinese companies, a lot of these companies are massive, like companies like SenseTime, Face++, they want to list on, you know, the New York Stock Exchange. They want to sell to foreign governments and to customers in the West. Like, all of these companies deserve scrutiny, and I think at some point they're responsive. And I think additionally, I would say, like, it's to me, like, at least in my personal experience, it's a lot easier to put pressure on a company than to put pressure on a government like China.
Thank you. Before I go and look for questions, I would like to have Arslan also comment on this. Like, I don't know, which are the directions that you see need to be, like, I don't know, treaded more, and I mean, there is obvious solidarity, but like, okay, where do you see ways to make this better, and stakeholders to engage more?
Well, I always like to use the Iran example. You know, Iran constantly gets pressure from the world because of its nuclear program. You know, hey, Iran, you're building nuclear bombs. And then Iran goes, no, we're not. Come and check out for yourself. And the world is given unfettered access. And Iran are pressured to open up their borders, because if they don't, what happens? They get sanctioned. You know, so we're not. And what's happening now? We tell China, open up your borders. You know, let's see. Give us unfettered access. Don't put us on Pomtican or stage tours. China isn't being pressured enough, unfortunately. You know, economic sanctions, boycotting of goods. And whenever we hear, so right now in the US, they're trying to pass the Uyghur Slave Labor or Forced Labor Act. China reacts to that because they know if you hit them where it hurts, which is the money, which is the economy, the only way that we can ever see in the future for the CCP to either fall altogether or sort of ease up is if it can satisfy its people financially, because this is the promise that they gave to Chinese people. And so even recently with the Evergrande scandal and other things, you see sort of people causing disharmony because you're hitting them where it hurts. So I'm hoping that the UN, European Parliament, whatever, places sanctions and essentially puts more pressure on the Chinese government, because we're certainly not seeing it. Statements of condemnation is not enough anymore.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions from the audience? Looking at the live audience at this point. Yes. Is there? Oh yeah, there is a microphone there.
Thank you. My question would be, because we focus a lot on the occupied territories now, on the autonomous regions, how the situation is for the Hui minority and so the Muslim minority which is present in all of China, because there have been some commentators who say that the disciplinary violence is also stretching over to the Hui minority, and others say that's not true. So I was just wondering whether you can comment on that.
Okay. Maybe Arslan, do you want to comment on that, or Maya?
I'm happy to answer on that
Okay.
because I've worked with the Huis. If Arslan, would you prefer?
Either I can chime in afterwards. That's fine.
Okay, so one thing for sure is that the Hui Muslims, who are well, they're not Turkic. They look more like Han Chinese. I guess one should start by saying that. They're considered to be more, quote, assimilated to the mainstream Chinese culture than the Turkic Muslims are. One thing for sure is that they have not been put in political education camps in outside of Xinjiang. They have been detained in Xinjiang. But a lot of them live outside of Xinjiang, and they, the kind of abuses that have been taking place to them is primarily in the form of their mosques have been transformed from kind of more Arabic or forms to kind of more Chinese forms looking. So the onion dome, I don't know what's the proper word for that, has been taken down to look more Chinese and this is the impulse under presidency's signification of religion, and that is again part of the broader repression of religion and human rights in China.
Thank you. Arslan, do you still want to?
Yeah, especially not unfortunately, a lot of the clips that you see of raised mosques, especially on just social media on Twitter, are actually from Hui areas. And as you mentioned, Huis are, we have heard, Huis are being also incarcerated in the Uyghur region, not so much in let's say Lanzhou or Ningxiao or these other areas, but there have also been some videos where mosques have been closed off and the Huis are able to protest. What happened to those individuals who are protesting, God knows. You don't really hear about that anymore, but China will believe that they would be next because, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? Yes, I have some online questions, I think. Yes.
So this is a question from our online chat for Maya. This person writes, Maya described the numbers and the names being spat out by the police computer, and that the police was overwhelmed by this. And this person wants to know, do the police have certain quotas for numbers of people to be stopped or interned? If so, what are the consequences of that, and how are individuals to be targeted chosen, or who does the choosing? So some more details about the police app that was shown.
Sure. So there has been some evidence that police have been given quotas for arrest. But again, as to whether this is a practice across the region of Xinjiang, or is that being done in certain specific local areas of Xinjiang, is a little bit unclear. But you can see the mentions of quotas in official documents, as well as some reports by people who were in Xinjiang. So the situation with police officers in Xinjiang is that they have been very stressed out. Essentially, they complain about not having much sleep or even vacation. You might find it very weird to think that someone who is essentially the oppressor complaining about this, but it gives you a sense of the amount of bureaucratic effort to detain that many people. How do they choose the victims? Like I said, the IJOP kind of turns out lists of people who are suspicious under these criteria. And then the police would go through they would interrogate them, but also go through, a comprehensive evaluation according to the authorities, looking at this person's behavior to see whether or not that person is unusual or threatening to the authorities. But the problem is, if you look at the official documentation, the government's slogan here is to detain as many or those who should be detained should be detained. In other words, instead of people are being innocent until proven guilty, as in what should be the basic legal principle, in Xinjiang, the Uyghurs are guilty before they're proven innocent. So unless there is some reason strongly to believe that this person is completely safe, they are unsafe. So that is why these criteria are bogus, and the detention in Xinjiang is arbitrary. And of course, there is a fair amount of torture that is involved in police detention facilities, following which these people are detained.
Okay. Yeah, it always strikes me what you say also, like the people that actually have to execute it. I mean, they're not. I mean, these willing, or well, not always these willing and fully convinced people that are doing those kind of things. And I wanted to also see with Arslan. I mean, have you also felt solidarity from Han Chinese people, or I guess maybe also Hong Kongers or Tibetans, I don't know, other diaspora groups in the struggle in the Uyghur strife right now?
Oh yeah, definitely, especially with Tibetans, Hong Kongers, Mongolians, and the Chinese people that are striving for sort of democracy in overall China. But for us, there's a bigger issue where this isn't the first time, as I mentioned, even though the Uyghurs are in the headlines only in the past 5 years, raising of mosques, is not a new thing, or religious oppression is not a new thing. It's just scaled up to where everyone is being targeted now. Before, you would have certain townships, actually certain individuals, and then certain towns and certain regions, but now it's just like, oh, you're Uyghur, you're automatically blacklisted. But that solidarity, within those groups, but unfortunately, the solidarity we haven't gotten from, we've gotten from sort of laymen or Muslim citizens, but not necessarily Muslim governments, which is very sad. So you would see in places like the UN, where the support for the Uyghurs you get from Western European, America, Canada, Australia nations, but that not just lack of support, but support for China's policies against what they believe or they've bought into counterterrorism, and essentially supporting the oppression being done to the Uyghurs, these Muslim countries have signed on to, essentially, on many occasions.
Yes, I mean, I think that's really also an issue that's been bothering many. Okay, where is that voice also? I don't know, it's basically, well, and that's assuming just the economic clout that China has that is really kind of like covering that kind of acquiescence, I guess. Megha, I mean, you have also reported from various countries around the world, and I'm assuming also like a lot about Chinese issues. So, I mean, how do you see that? Like, how close is that grip of China on countries that do not want to speak out, and how is that influencing this debate?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. A lot of times it's hard to see because these kind of influence mechanisms happen in a different context in each place, like in each country or region, and they often sort of collide with different factions within national governments. You know, like Turkey is a good example where the public is overwhelmingly, like extremely supportive of Uyghurs and has been for a very long time because of a shared cultural background, religion, and linguistic background, but you see the government sort of moving back and forth closer and farther away from China, and you can see the kind of pressure that the Chinese government is exacting there. Kazakhstan is another example where they have advocated, it seems like quite successfully, for a lot of people with ties to the country, like for instance people with Kazakh nationality or green cards or with a Kazakh spouse or children, to be released from Xinjiang at a time when passports were extremely difficult for, or are extremely difficult for ethnic minorities to obtain to be able to go to Kazakhstan. But, you know, in other ways, like, you know, I'll just give a very anecdotal example, but I'm often asked, you know, why is it that Muslim majority countries have not been more vocal on this issue, including journalists? And the truth is, like, I think, you know, just setting governments aside, like, for journalists, like, I've personally met like 2 people from 2 different countries who talked about basically pitching and even producing a piece on Xinjiang and then having it killed at the last minute because of a call from the Chinese embassy actually in that country. And that's something that you wouldn't normally think of. You think of censorship as coming from that government. But you know, if you work at a publication that is already censoring itself because of government rules, and you get a call from a powerful actor, whether it's like, you know, a powerful company or even a foreign embassy, there's really no incentive for your boss to keep that piece in the paper or TV station or what have you. So I think it helps to think about Chinese pressure in the context of like authoritarianism, you know, which exists on a sliding scale, but as it exists in other parts of the world, and how those 2 things can interact.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're definitely right about that. I mean, and this is really also coming more and more on the radar, like, well, China influencing the international human rights system, like, I don't know, spreading that narrative, like we also heard in the first keynote, and basically, like, yeah, I mean, sometimes using techniques that activists inside of China already know for a long time, these red lines that are never defined, but that kind of like then stick in people's, governments, journalists, businesses' minds, like, oh, I can't talk about that because that would, like, I don't know, set off, and it creates a system where, yeah, it becomes harder and harder to have these conversations, and I think that's something that we should really be aware of and basically be very prudent of. With that being said, we still have time for one last question from the audience, and we even have 2, so maybe let's do the 2 questions and we can treat them together.
Thank you. This is specifically for Megha, actually. You meant there's been some recent conversation saying that a lot of the detention of Uyghurs has moved more away from these extrajudicial camps and more into the kind of official prison system. That doesn't necessarily mean that people are detained because of like crime or what we would consider crimes in, say, Germany, but that essentially makes it kind of harder to talk about that as something that is unfair, as an unjust thing. So when you were just talking about this camp being built after that official said that people had graduated, it sounded like there seems to have been expansion of the camp system still, so I'd be curious kind of what your view of this is.
Well, let's take the other question as well, so we can do them together.
Yeah, I have a question about the kids. you said that like they've been kept in boarding schools, but how about have you been able to figure out like their experience and like what happens when they're teenagers and they become adults? Do they get moved around to adult camps, or do they let them go because they're considered, I don't know, brainwashed or whatever through the system? Yeah, because like a lot of these accounts I feel like come from an adult experience, and I don't hear anything about these kids.
Okay, I suggest, Megha, you have the first question, and then maybe we can go to Arslan and Maya for the second question.
It's a really good question. I was just thinking I was probably too imprecise in my language. So basically, yeah, it's a tough one to answer. I think it's basically it's kind of like this theory that's out there. I think there's a lot to corroborate it. For our analysis, we basically, because we were looking at the physical characteristics of these facilities, we essentially, like all of the, like the map that I showed you of all of the facilities incorporates both camps and prisons. But we looked at facilities only that were built after 2017, which is the kind of like rough start of this program. So that's sort of where we started. So I guess just for anyone who's not totally familiar, so like prisons are obviously part of the criminal justice system in China. With camps, you know, we're talking about facilities that are ostensibly for education, right? So that means that you don't have to have committed a crime to go there. And in fact, I think nobody that I've interviewed, like, you know, has ever said that they were even accused of committing a crime, which means that they never saw a day in court and so forth. Like, these are people that committed offenses that are not even illegal under Chinese law, like things like using WhatsApp or having, you know, a religious photo on their phone, or like very, very kind of like small, quote unquote, transgressions. So, you know, I've heard from people that, you know, like, I'm trying to think about how to answer this. So like within the, like based on my interviews, so I've done a few dozen interviews mainly with former detainees at camps, not former prisoners, that were held during this time period, 2017 till now. And a number of people said that even within the camps where they stayed, people were divided up into like several categories, depending on how severe their offenses were. So one theory goes that the people that had committed the quote unquote like most serious offenses, you know, things like, you know, training to be an imam and stuff like that, you know, seriously religious people or people with strong connections to Muslim countries, Muslim majority countries abroad and stuff like that, are the ones that are going to be tried for prison sentences. And then the people that had the kind of like loosest allegations against them, often they would be released within 2 years. Release is not really release in the context of Xinjiang because it is like an open air prison. Like once you're released, you may be under house arrest or town arrest. It's very difficult for you to travel even outside of your town, and everything is monitored based on your cell phone and checkpoints and other methods, as Maya elucidated. So the reason that it's really hard to check any of this is that, like, basically at a certain point, there stopped being such a flow of former detainees that would come outside of China and then thus be, you know, able to speak to the media or speak publicly in some other fashion. A lot of the former detainees that left were held in these camps around like between like 2017 to 2018. After that, it's really rare. So a lot of the information we have is pretty dated. So the point where the governor of Xinjiang said like everyone has graduated, was already like 2019. So it's very hard to monitor kind of like how the system has changed since there, but it's something that I'm interested in.
Okay, thank you. No, that's completely fine. Arslan, would you like to go into a little bit, because we have little time left, but the vocational schools that you also mentioned, and there's been talk about like these angel care, like schools. I mean, that's what they're called for children. Like, would you like to say a bit more about that?
To the question specifically, what happens to the kids when they're teenagers? The program hasn't gone on for that long to sort of look into what's been going on there, but there have been certain reports where, say, an 11-year-old, I think it was 11 or 12-year-old girl, she had gone into the boarding school, and she spent 2 or 3 years there, and then by the end, she could not speak the Uyghur language. Someone who was fluent in the Uyghur language, she couldn't speak it anymore. So it just goes to show that they are forced to speak the Uyghur, the way they are taught, and then they're forced to speak it. And then obviously this has a profound effect on, they won't be able to learn about their culture, traditions, because that's how the cutting of ties of traditions, religion, culture is a big thing. And so if this continues the next, in a decade or two, you will see physically Uyghurs, but the essence of Uyghurness, or is no longer going to exist, and it'll make it illegal. So, and you'll see in documents where specifically children who are born in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s are very dangerous. But generally, the ones even end up in the camps can be young as the actual camps with adults. I've heard sometimes 14, 15, and 16 as well. But it's hard to say that transition from childhood, because it's only been going on for at least half a decade.
Okay, thank you. Maya, for some closing remarks, either the first or the second questions, is there something you would like to add?
I think the question has to do with the fact to remember is that the massive abuses that are taking place in Xinjiang are ongoing, despite the Chinese government's efforts to obscure them. And they are not going to go away. Like what Arslan said, the children who are being affected are going to grow up, and are the inter-ethnic relations between Han Chinese and Uyghurs and other ethnic groups are going to be essentially a ticking time bomb, I think, for China going forward, regardless of what the future of the Chinese Communist Party. It's going to be a very difficult situation for the different groups of people involved that have to face each other one way or the other. So unfortunately, we would have to handle that in the future if the human rights situation does not improve there.
Okay, thank you so much. And then, well, thank you, all three of you, for this very rich panel. I think we've touched upon a lot of different issues, and I mean, we can only look forward with like more of that ingenuity that you all have displayed, and courage as well, to like keep laying bare what is happening and keep thinking and imagining on how to make things better. So thank you so much for participating, and I think we can close the first day of the conference with these words. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I just joined at the end to introduce what is going to happen tomorrow. And so thank you very much for this very important panel. We have been discussing really important issue. We start tomorrow at 2 with the panel Art and Resistance from the Mainland to the Diaspora. So we will discuss not only form of artistic expression that are inside China, but also from people that left China. Then we go on with the panel Voices, Tactics and Technology to Challenge Dominant Narratives. And we will go back to the discourse of the Hong Kong movement, connecting it with the film that we also showed 2 weeks ago. So also don't miss this panel, because it's very important to understand the social situation during and after the Hong Kong protest. But we will also speak about challenging dominant narratives in general in relation to the powers of truth. That is also the title of the conference. And then we end with the keynote, Surveilling a Surveillance State, an Ethical Dilemma. And here we will also have a perspective from the West, and also discussing more in detail the discourse of surveillance on China and from China. The important part is also the workshop on Sunday, in which we will go more in depth on the discussion that we had today. So we start at 11 with the workshop Digital Self-Defense. And here we also go into the discourse of the Hong Kong protests, but not only. This is more a workshop on the digital rights and activism and understanding how to use the tool in security. The workshop here is run by Glacier Chang Ching Kwong. There are still possibility of register, so you are welcome to do. And then there is the workshop with Megha and Alison, in which we also go more in detail, investigating the Xinjiang detention camp using satellite imagery. And the workshop is actually sold out, was really popular. So unfortunately, I cannot say you can still register. I mean, this is a good news for you in a sense. And then I also want to end by mentioning another big work that we have been doing at the Disruption Network Lab in the course of the year. This will be the work also that is going to inform the next conference that we will do end of November. Is our book, Whistleblowing for Change, in which we have been inviting 29 people from past speakers of the Disruption Network Lab conferences since 2015, and also new writers that we approach through different networks of trust. And the idea of the book is really to discuss and investigate the consequence of whistleblowing on politics, society, and culture. And we are speaking about various different streams, from the drone war, from anti-corruption, also art. We will have a piece from Magnus Ag that has been really great in co-curating this conference with me, and is also analyzing the discourse of artistic expression in China and beyond, also in other countries in which artists are on threat. So I just wanted to mention for the public here, because the book is already available for pre-sale, so if you want to get it, you are welcome. And yes, so with this we will end the day, and thank you very much again, and see you tomorrow at 2 p.m. And also for the people that are watching us on streaming, I would also remind again that we will be live again on streaming, so you can participate through the through the chat. So thank you again, Stijn. Thank you, Megha, for being here, and also Arslan, Maya in remote. This was a very important discussion. Thank you.